In the Halcyon belt, the air doesn't belong to God. It belongs to the Vane dynasty, and they charge for every lungful. My name is Solène, and for 24 years I've lived as a synapse pilot, a fancy term for a human copper wire. I don't just live in the walls, I am the walls. While the elite on the Isle of Glass breathe filtered jasmine, I'm down in the humid guts of the machinery, my nervous system plugged into the island's sensory grid to catch the fractures before the ocean swallows us whole. I was supposed to be a ghost, a disposable piece of hardware with skin too dark and blood too tired for the pure world above. But tonight, the grid didn't just vibrate, it bled. I was wired into the main conduit at 300 meters deep when the pressure seals screamed and the door to my terminal shattered. It wasn't a technician who stepped through. It was Kalen Vane, the heir to the Empire, drenched in the blood of his own elite guards and holding a look that said the world was ending. Welcome back to the channel. If you're ready for a story where the person they tried to bury becomes the only one who can dig them out, hit that like button, comment "Pulse" below, and subscribe. In the archipelago of silence, nobody hears you scream, unless you're the one holding the microphone. The neural jacks at the base of my skull hummed with a low-frequency thrum, a constant reminder that my mind wasn't entirely my own. I sat on the cold floor of the maintenance terminal, my back pressed against the vibrating titanium hull, cables snaking from my spine like umbilical cords of copper and light. This was my life. 12-hour shifts as a biometric slave, a synapse pilot tasked with feeling the structural pain of a floating city that hated my very existence. To the overseers who paced the catwalks above, I was an anomaly, a girl from the Senegalese colonies whose neural conductivity was freakishly high. They didn't see a woman. They saw a high-yield biological component. The racial tension in the belt wasn't loud. It was atmospheric. It was the way the pure-form residents of the upper tiers clutched their oxygen masks tighter when I entered a lift. It was the colony worker badge pinned to my industrial jumpsuit, a mark that signaled I was only allowed in the Isle of Glass if something was broken. Purity of form was the law of the land, a belief that those with the lightest skin and the cleanest DNA were destined to breathe the best air, while those of us with the static in our blood were meant for the grease and the grind. I've spent my life being invisible, a dark shadow in a world of blinding white light and sterile chrome, absorbing the insults as easily as I absorbed the electrical surges from the grid. Every day was a calculation of survival. I traded my nervous system for biocredits, pennies on the dollar compared to the wealth that flowed through the pipes I patched. I needed those credits to buy my brother's way out of the Isle of Ash, a prison island where names were replaced by serial numbers. My own body was a map of the syndicate's greed, the faint scars along my arms where the wires occasionally overheated, the permanent tremor in my fingers from years of high-voltage exposure. I was a tool, a wrench with a heartbeat, waiting for the day my neural paths finally fried and I was replaced by the next glitch in the system. But the grid was acting strange tonight. The Isle of Steel, usually a steady rhythmic heartbeat of machinery, was stuttering. I felt it through the jacks, a jagged, irregular pulse that tasted like copper and panic. Someone was rerouting the security sensors, creating blind spots in the 300-meter sector. It was a coup. I could feel the betrayal in the wires before I heard the first shot. Then, the door to my terminal exploded. Kalen Vane collapsed into the room, his signature charcoal coat soaked in a deep, visceral red. This was the man the workers called the deep-sea devil, the son of the high custodian who was rumoured to have ice water in his veins. He looked up, his eyes finding mine through the haze of smoke and sparks. He wasn't looking for a technician to fix a pipe. He was looking for the only person in the world who knew how to find the shadows in a city of glass. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized my invisibility was gone. The monster had found me, and for the first time in my life, the grid felt like it was finally coming alive. Kalen Vane didn't move like a man who had just escaped an assassination attempt. He moved like the water that surrounded us, heavy, inevitable, and utterly devoid of warmth. As I stabilized the neural jacks at the base of my skull, I watched him rise. The deep-sea devil was a name whispered in the humid mess halls of the Drift Quarter, usually followed by a sign of the cross. The story went that during a sabotage of the primary thermal core years ago, Kalen had been trapped in a flooded decompression chamber. He had stayed submerged for 10 minutes, his lungs filled with the brine of the Atlantic, only to walk out of the water after the pressure dropped. His eyes changed and his pulse slowed to a glacial rhythm. They said he didn't breathe like the rest of us anymore, that he was more machine than man, a creature of the abyss dressed in a tailor-made suit. Up close, the rumors felt like understatements. He stood over 6 feet of rigid, scarred efficiency, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the small maintenance terminal. He didn't offer a hand or an apology for the blood he was tracking onto my workspace. He simply stood there, his chest barely moving, his gaze scanning the flickering monitors with a cold, literal precision that made my skin crawl. To Kalen, the world wasn't made of people or feelings. It was made of trajectories, fail-safes, and casualties. He was the ultimate product of the Vane dynasty, isolated by his own power, a monster born from the very silence he was sworn to protect. "The internal sensors in Sector 4 are dead," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that I felt more in my neural link than in my ears. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked through me, as if I were just another diagnostic readout. "Your biometric signature is the only one still active on this level. That makes you a target, or a tool. Decide which one you want to be in the next 30 seconds. The casual cruelty of his words should have stung, but in the Halcyon belt, I was used to being evaluated for my utility. What was different was the way he spoke, without the sneer of the other veins. He didn't care about my purity of form or the color of my skin. To a man who had seen the bottom of the ocean and lived, the petty racisms of the surface seemed to be a noise he had long ago filtered out. He was a monster, yes, but he was a logical one. He saw me for exactly what I was, the only person capable of guiding him through the dark veins of the island. "I'm a pilot, not a soldier," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I reached back and began the painful process of unhooking the primary cables from my spine, the sparks dancing against my dark skin. "But if you want to get to the silence core without being vaporized by the automated turrets your sister just recoded, you're going to need the static." Kalen finally turned his head, his eyes, a piercing, unnatural grey, locking onto mine. For a moment, the sterile air of the terminal felt pressurized, as if we were both back in that flooded chamber. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply stepped closer, the smell of salt and iron clinging to him like a shroud. "The turrets are the least of our concerns, Solène," he murmured, using my name for the first time with a chilling familiarity. "My sister isn't just trying to kill me. She's trying to drown the world I built. And I've already learned that you don't need to breathe to survive. You just need to know where the oxygen is hidden." He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist, not touching me, but marking the boundary of his protection. In the flickering amber light, I saw the truth of the deep-sea devil. He wasn't isolated because he was cruel. He was isolated because he was the only thing in this archipelago that wasn't a lie. He was the monster at the door, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was the one who held the key. The descent into the dead zones was a journey into the architectural skeleton of the Halcyon Belt. A place where the luxury of the upper tiers was stripped away to reveal the raw, unpainted steel of the machine. As we slipped through a service hatch, Kalen moved with a predatory grace that defied his reputation as a devil. He didn't need a flashlight. He seemed to navigate by the same tactile memory I used, as if the cold metal of the bulkheads was an extension of his own skin. I led the way, my fingers trailing along the data conduits, feeling the static of the island's nervous system through the residual hum in my neural jacks. "The secondary relay is bypassed," I whispered, my voice swallowed by the immense hollow ring of the tower's interior. "We can move through the ventilation shafts for 3 sectors, but after that, we'll be visible to the infrared scanners." Kalen stopped. He didn't look at the conduits I was tracking. He looked at me, his gaze fixed on the base of my skull where the copper wires were braided into my hair. "The scanners in Sector 7 haven't worked in 4 months, Solène. Not since you recalibrated the dampeners to compensate for the microfracture in the hull." I froze, my hand hovering over a lever. That recalibration hadn't been on any official log. It was a ghost patch I'd done in the middle of the night to keep the vibration from shattering the workspace of the lower-tier technicians, my people. It was a secret, a quiet act of rebellion that should have been invisible to anyone sitting on the 43rd floor. "How do you know about that?" I turned, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "That data was scrubbed from the main hub." "I didn't need the hub," Kalen said, his voice flat but carrying a strange, resonant weight. He stepped into my personal space, his presence cold as a deep-sea current. "I watched you do it. I've watched you for 212 shifts. I watched the way you rerouted the oxygen to the nursery in the drift when the scrubbers failed in July. I watched you tune the resonance of the main turbine, not because the syndicate ordered it, but because the frequency was giving the worker hives migraines." The realization hit me harder than the neural drain ever could. All those months I thought I was a ghost in the machine, a black girl performing invisible labor in a world that refused to see her. I had been the center of a private universe. He hadn't been watching me like a predator stalking prey, or like a boss monitoring an asset. He had been watching me because I was the only thing in the entire archipelago that made sense to him. In a world of pure-form aristocrats who saw the island as a bank account, I was the only one who cared about the pulse. Kalen, the man who had survived the crushing silence of the abyss, had found the only other soul that vibrated at his frequency. He was a creature of the deep, and I was the one who kept the deep from collapsing. "You were spying on me," I breathed, the fear beginning to melt into something sharper, something more intimate. "I was listening to you," Kalen corrected, his grey eyes softening for the briefest of seconds. "The Vane dynasty is a cacophony of greed and lies. It's loud, Solène. It's deafening. But when you plug into the grid, the island goes quiet. You bring the chaos into a perfect singular note. I didn't think anyone else could feel the rhythm of the steel. I thought I was the only one left who knew that the Halcyon Belt isn't a city, it's a living thing." He reached out, his hand stopping just short of the neural jack at my neck. He didn't touch the skin, but I felt the heat of his palm against the static in the air. For a man who didn't breathe like a human, he had a way of making me feel every breath I took. We weren't just a pilot and a prince anymore. We were two anomalies in a sterile world, finally acknowledging that we were made of the same lightning. "The hunters are coming, Solène," he murmured, the cold literalism returning to his voice as the distant screech of a security drone echoed through the shaft. "They think they can erase the static. They don't realize that the static is the only thing holding this world together." He turned away then, but the distance between us had vanished. As we moved deeper into the dark, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't being used. I was being seen. The transition from the rusted, humming marrow of the towers to the Isle of Glass was a sensory assault. We emerged from a service conduit into a world of blinding crystalline light and the cloying scent of artificial jasmine. It was the festival of the Meridian, the one night a year when the pure form elite celebrated the stability of a world built on the backs of people they refused to name. To move through the crowds undetected, Kalen had stripped his bloodied coat, revealing a high-collared slate shirt that marked him as nobility, while I was draped in the stolen shroud cloak of iridescent silk. But no amount of silk could hide the fact that I was a static girl walking in a sanctuary of porcelain. The Isle of Glass wasn't just wealthy, it was surgically clean. As we navigated the marble plazas, the air felt thin and over-filtered, lacking the honest, metallic weight of the lower sectors. The racism here didn't scream, it simmered. It was in the way the crowds parted for us, not out of respect for me, but out of a visceral, biological recoil. I felt the weight of 1,000 gazes, cold, blue-eyed assessments that saw my dark skin as a blemish on their curated horizon. They looked at my neural braids not as a feat of engineering, but as a brand of servitude. "Keep your head up, Solène," Kalen murmured, his voice a low vibration that anchored me amidst a sea of whispers. "They aren't looking at you. They're looking at the mirror of their own obsolescence. They hate that the island's pulse is in your hands and not theirs." We reached the Grand Pavilion, a structure of curved diamond glass that hovered over the bioluminescent sea. To get to the primary relay, we had to cross the ballroom, a space filled with the syndicate's most powerful delegates. I felt the familiar phantom itch in my neural jacks, the social erasure that came with being a colony worker in a space that demanded perfection. A group of young, vain loyalists, dressed in shimmering finery, blocked our path. One of them, a man with skin so pale it was almost translucent, stepped forward with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Kalen," the man drawled, his voice dripping with the casual arrogance of the elite. "We heard you had an accident in the sublevels, and I see you've brought a piece of the equipment with you." He didn't look at Kalen. He looked at me, his eyes trailing down my arm with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Before I could react, he reached out, his fingers gripping my bicep with a rough, proprietary force, as if he were checking the quality of a shipment. "A bit dark for the ballroom, isn't it? Is it even housebroken, or does it just vibrate?" The air in the pavilion didn't just go cold, it stopped. I felt Kalen's presence shift beside me, the glacial calm of the deep-sea devil shattering into something far more ancient and violent. In a movement so fast the human eye couldn't track it, Kalen's hand was around the man's throat. He slammed the loyalist against a diamond glass pillar with a sound like a gunshot. The man's feet dangled inches off the floor, his face turning a mottled purple as Kalen's grip tightened. Kalen didn't look angry, he looked lethal. His grey eyes were devoid of light, reflecting the black ocean below us. "You touched her," Kaelin whispered, the sound carrying further than a shout. "You laid a hand on the only thing in this city that actually has a soul." "Kaelin, stop," I breathed, reaching out to touch his arm. I could feel the murderous intent radiating off him, a subsonic hum that threatened to bring the glass down around us. "We don't have time." "The relay, Kaelin. Focus on the pulse." He didn't let go for a long, agonizing second. He leaned in closer to the man, his voice a jagged promise. "If you ever look at her again, I will personally ensure your name is deleted from every server in the belt. You won't just be dead. You will have never existed." He dropped the man, who collapsed into a heap of silk and bruised ego. Kaelin didn't wait for a reaction. He wrapped his hand around mine, the first time he had actually touched my skin, and pulled me through the stunned crowd. His palm was calloused and warm, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the aisle. As we reached the shadows of the relay station, I realized that the monster wasn't protecting his asset. He was protecting his heart. And in the world of light, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The relay station was a cathedral of data, a hum of whispering servers and cold blue light tucked beneath the grand pavilion. Here, the air was so pure it tasted of nothing, a stark, sterile contrast to the iron-scented warmth of Kaelin's hand, which he finally released as I knelt before the primary terminal. My fingers trembled as I bypassed the biometric locks, my neural jacks screaming in protest as I forced a direct link into the syndicate's deep core ledger. I wasn't looking for security codes anymore. I was looking for the truth behind the tremors I'd felt in the grid. "Accessing the atmospheric distribution logs," I whispered, the data streaming behind my eyelids in a frantic blur of gold and crimson. "Kaelin, something is wrong. The reserves aren't low, they're full. The drought they announced to the public is a fabrication." Kaelin stood behind me, his shadow stretching long across the floor, his silence more ominous than any siren. "Look at the routing protocol, Solène. Follow the flow of the O2 credits." I pushed deeper, my mind diving into the cold logic of the vein dynasty. What I found wasn't a shortage, it was a scheduled execution. The ledger wasn't a bank statement, it was a death warrant. I saw the command lines, signed and timestamped by Kaelin's sister Vesper. On the next cycle, the oxygen flow to the non-essential sectors, the drift quarter, the worker hives, the industrial nurseries, was set to be diverted. It wasn't being moved to storage, it was being vented into the ocean to create a stability surplus for the Isle of Glass. "They're calling it the atmospheric debt recovery," I choked out, the air in my own lungs suddenly feeling like lead. "Kaelin, they're going to suffocate the lower tiers. My brother, the nurseries, thousands of people are being written off as a line item expense." The stakes were no longer about a coup or a throne. They were about the very breath of my people. The Vane family wasn't just hoarding wealth, they were weaponizing the atmosphere to prune the population of anyone they deemed a biological burden. In their eyes, my skin and my heritage made me a liability, and now they were moving to erase the static once and for all. "They think the belt is a garden," Kaelin said, his voice dropping into that terrifying subglacial register. He placed a hand on the back of my chair, his knuckles white. "And they think the workers are the weeds. My father built this archipelago to survive the world, but my sister wants to rule a graveyard of her own making." The realization hit me with the force of a pressure drop. The racism I had faced every day, the sneers, the colony worker badges, the social erasure, had all been leading to this. It was easier to kill a people if you had spent decades convincing yourself they weren't actually breathing the same air. To the elite above us, we were just components that had become too expensive to maintain. "We have to stop the vent," I said, spinning the chair to face him. My eyes were burning with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "I can reroute the manual overrides, but I need to be physically in the sub-basement core. If I don't stop the sequence, the vents open in 4 hours." Kalen looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the deep-sea devil. I saw a man who was prepared to burn his own house down to save the only person who understood its heart. He didn't ask if I was ready. He didn't ask if it was worth the risk. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy drive, the kill switch for the entire atmospheric grid. "Then we go to the core," he murmured, his grey eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "They want to talk about debt, Solen. Let's show them what they owe the people who kept them alive in the dark." The personal cost was irrelevant now. My brother's face flashed in my mind, his smile in the rusted gardens of the drift. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was the failsafe. And as we turned toward the maintenance lift that would take us back into the crushing depths, I knew that if I had to choose between the Vane's empire and the air in my brother's lungs, I would let the Isle of Glass sink into the abyss without a second thought. The maintenance lift descended with a gut-wrenching lurch, plunging us away from the crystalline lies of the Isle of Glass and back into the pressurized gloom of the tower's throat. The air here was thicker, smelling of grease and heavy water, but the silence between us was heavier still. Kalen stood by the control panel, his gaze fixed on the floor numbers as they bled away, but I could feel his focus. A cold, sharp needle of attention drilling into me. The neural drain was starting to take its toll. My vision blurred at the edges, and the static in my mind was no longer a hum, but a roar. "You're fading, Solen," Kalen said, his voice cutting through the thrum of the lift. He didn't move toward me, but I felt the atmosphere in the small car tighten. "The grid is pulling too much from you. Your conductivity is peaking because you're trying to track the vent sequences and the hunters at the same time." "I have to," I gasped, leaning my head against the vibrating metal wall. "If I lose the signal, we won't know which corridor they flooded with nitrogen. I'm the only one who can feel where the air is still clean." I slid down the wall, my strength failing as a sharp spike of sensory data. A distant door closing 3 sectors away shot through my spine like a hot wire. My breathing came in ragged bursts. I felt the racial weight of my life in the belt crushing me. The exhaustion of always having to be faster, sharper, and more durable just to be considered human. Kalen knelt in front of me. He didn't hesitate this time. He reached out and cupped my face, his thumbs brushing against the dark skin of my cheekbones. His touch was like a grounding wire. The chaotic noise in my head suddenly found a conductor. "Let me in," he whispered. It wasn't a request. It was an anchor thrown into a storm. "I have the biometric stability you lack. If you link us, I can shoulder the sensory load. I can be the processor for the rage you're trying to suppress." I looked at him, terrified. To plug a vein, to plug him, into my neural link was a violation of every colony law I'd been raised with. We were told the elite's minds were too pure for our static, that we would fry them. But Kalen wasn't pure. He was a creature of the abyss, scarred and hollowed out by the same world that was trying to erase me. I reached for the auxiliary cable at my waist, my fingers trembling as I guided the needle-thin lead toward the port at the base of his skull. As the connection clicked into place, the world didn't just change, it exploded. For a heartbeat, I was no longer Solène. I was Kaelin. I felt the terrifying subglacial rhythm of his heart, a pulse so slow it felt like the turning of the earth. I felt the cold, literal vacuum of his lungs, a ghost of the drowning that had defined him. But beneath the ice, I felt it. A white-hot, protective rage that burned with the intensity of a dying star. It wasn't the chaotic anger of a man. It was the calculated, focused fury of a monster who had found the one thing in the universe he refused to let break. And Kaelin felt me. Through the link, he saw the Isle of Glass not as a paradise, but as a cage of light. He saw the sneers of his sisters through my eyes. He felt the sting of every colony worker insult I'd ever swallowed. He felt the weight of my brother's safety and the desperate, exhausted love I had for a people who were being murdered by his own bloodline. He let out a sharp, jagged breath, his fingers tightening on my shoulders. The static in my mind smoothed out into a crystalline map. With his military-grade mental discipline acting as a filter, the sensory overload became a weapon. I could see every guard, every vent, and every heartbeat in the sub-basement core. "They have no idea," Kaelin growled, his voice sounding in my head and in the air simultaneously. "They think you're a tool. They don't realize you're the conscience of this entire archipelago." The rage he carried wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the world that had dared to make me feel small. It was a protective shield, a wall of fire that he built around my mind. In that moment of quiet, wired together in a falling lift, the distinction between master and slave vanished. We were a single frequency, a shared pulse of rebellion. "We're here," I whispered, the doors of the lift beginning to hiss open. Kaelin didn't unplug. He kept the link active, his hand sliding down to my waist to pull me up. He looked at the dark corridor ahead, his eyes glowing with a reflected, predatory light. "Stay close to me, Solène. Feel what I feel. Because tonight, the static is going to scream, and I'm going to make sure they hear every note." The sub-basement core was a cathedral of churning pistons and glowing oxygen vats, the air thick with the ozone of high-voltage machinery. Through our neural link, the room was a symphony of pressure. I could feel the life-giving gas straining against the valves, desperate to be released into the lungs of the workers below. But as we stepped onto the central catwalk, the symphony was cut short by a sharp, rhythmic clapping that echoed against the titanium walls. Vesper Vane stepped out from behind a massive cooling column, flanked by 4 pure-form enforcers with mirrored visors. She looked radiant, her hair pulled back in a silver-threaded braid that mimicked my own neural cables, a cruel parody of my necessity. To her, this wasn't a war, it was a choreography. She looked at Kaelin with a mixture of pity and boredom before her eyes slid to me, narrowing with a focused, clinical malice. "You always had a penchant for broken things, Kaelin," Vesper drawled, her voice amplified by the core's acoustics. "But this? Plugging yourself into a colony rat? It's beneath the Vane name. It's unhygienic." Kaelin didn't flinch, but through the link, I felt his pulse spike. A localized earthquake of protective fury. He tightened his arm around my waist, his thumb pressing into the silk of my cloak. "The name is a tomb, Vesper. I'm just making sure you're the only one inside it." Vesper laughed, a cold, tinkling sound that grated against my sensory nerves. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the metal grating. "Oh, Solène, You think he loves you. You think this bond is anything more than a strategic bypass. He's using your nervous system to shield his own because he's too weak to face the abyss alone anymore. She let the words hang in the pressurized air, watching for the flinch she knew was coming. You're a temporary battery, darling. A disposable power cell for... are the only one who decides if you remain a ghost or become the storm. His voice dropped into a register that made the floor plates vibrate. Kill anyone who tries to take you from me. Not because you're mine to own, but because you're the only thing in this abyss that makes the silence worth hearing. The doubt vanished. The temporary battery was gone. I breathed in the scent of his salt and iron, felt the lethal focus of the deep-sea devil flowing through my veins, and I fired. The muzzle flash was a blinding strobe in the dark, illuminating Kaelin's grey eyes for a split second, unblinking, terrifying, and filled with a raw, protective worship. The first guard fell with a heavy metallic thud. I didn't flinch at the recoil. Kaelin's body absorbed it for me. We moved as a single entity, a four-armed god of the abyss navigating the catwalks. One by one, the red pinpricks of the enforcers were extinguished. My hands, guided by his, didn't miss. Every shot was a note in a violent symphony, a reclamation of the air we were being denied. In the heart of the Silence Core, surrounded by the ghost of a dying dynasty, I realized the truth. The monster wasn't the man behind me. The monster was the power he gave me. The terrifying, beautiful freedom to finally strike back at the world that had tried to keep me invisible. I wasn't the help anymore. I was the hand that held the trigger of the Empire. The shadows in the Silence Core didn't just fall, they suffocated. With a flick of her wrist, Vesper triggered the localized EMP, plunging the cathedral of machinery into a tomb of absolute lightless black. The hum of the oxygen that's died, replaced by the terrifying wet hiss of the primary vents beginning to cycle open. In the sudden void, the Enforcer's thermal optics flared to life, predatory red pinpricks circling us in the dark. I gasped, my neural link screaming as the sudden loss of the grid's power felt like a limb being torn from my mind. I was blind, stripped of the digital eyes that had guided me through the towers. The racial taunts of the veins echoed in the dark, the colony rat left to die in the dark she was born in. I felt the cold barrel of a rifle find my silhouette. But then, the world didn't just stop, it grounded. Kaelin's arm moved from my waist, sliding upward to lock around my ribs, pulling me flush against his chest. He was the only thing in the room that didn't need power to function. His heart, that glacial, rhythmic drum, beat against my spine, steadying the frantic vibration of my nerves. "Don't look for the light, Selene," he whispered, his voice a jagged caress that bypassed my ears and went straight into my consciousness through our shared link. "The light is a lie they use to distract you. Feel the displacement. Feel the heat of their blood. You are the nervous system of this island. You don't need eyes to see a cancer." He reached down, his large scarred hand closing over mine as he pulled the heavy, pulse-locked .45 from his holster. The metal was cold, but his grip was a furnace. He didn't just hand me the weapon, he became the frame that held it. He stood behind me, an unbreakable anchor in the pitch black, his chin resting against my shoulder as he guided my arm into the void. "There," he murmured, his breath ghosting over my copper-wired braids. "The guard at 2:00. He's breathing shallow. He's afraid of the dark. Aim at the sound of his fear." I felt it then, the static shifting. Through our connection, Kaelin's sensory deprivation and my neural sensitivity fused. I didn't see a man. I felt a thermal ripple in the air. My finger tightened on the trigger, but my hand trembled. The weight of taking a life, of crossing the line from the help to the executioner, threatened to shatter me. Kaelin's grip on my waist tightened, his thumb pressing into the soft skin above my hip, a silent, possessive command. They came here to turn off the air to your people, Solen. They came here to erase you because they think your life is a line item. You are the only one who decides if you remain a ghost or become the storm. His voice dropped into a register that made the floor plates vibrate. Kill anyone who tries to take you from me. Not because you're mine to own, but because you're the only thing in this abyss that makes the silence worth hearing. The doubt vanished. The temporary battery was gone. I breathed in the scent of his salt and iron, felt the lethal focus of the deep-sea devil flowing through my veins, and I fired. The muzzle flash was a blinding strobe in the dark, illuminating Kaelin's grey eyes for a split second. Unblinking, terrifying, and filled with a raw, protective worship. The first guard fell with a heavy metallic thud. I didn't flinch at the recoil. Kaelin's body absorbed it for me. We moved as a single entity, a four-armed god of the abyss navigating the catwalks. One by one, the red pinpricks of the enforcers were extinguished. My hands, guided by his, didn't miss. Every shot was a note in a violent symphony, a reclamation of the air we were being denied. In the heart of the Silence Core, surrounded by the ghosts of a dying dynasty, I realized the truth. The monster wasn't the man behind me. The monster was the power he gave me. The terrifying, beautiful freedom to finally strike back at the world that had tried to keep me invisible. I wasn't the help anymore. I was the hand that held the trigger of the Empire. The silence that followed the final gunshot was different than the engineered hush of the Vane dynasty. It was the heavy, hallowed quiet of a room that had just seen a god die. Vesper lay somewhere in the shadows of the core, her remote detonator shattered, her pure form world vibrating into dust. I stood in the center of the catwalk, the heavy pistol still warm in my hand, my chest heaving with air that suddenly felt sweeter, sharper, and entirely unearned. Kaelin didn't let go. He kept his hand anchored on my waist, his forehead coming to rest against mine as the primary vents hissed a final, defeated sigh. The purge had been halted. The air was staying with the people. The ascent to the 43rd floor was no longer a crawl through the marrow of the machine. It was a slow, deliberate march toward a throne that had been scrubbed clean of its lies. When the elevator doors opened to the High Custodian's office, the remaining board members and delegates didn't sneer. They didn't look for my colony worker badge or whisper about the static in my blood. They looked at the floor, or they looked at Kaelin, but mostly they looked at me with the wide, vacant eyes of people who had realized the wiring had developed a soul of its own. Kaelin didn't sit in the high-backed chair immediately. He walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Halcyon Belt, the bioluminescent ocean glowing like a bed of fallen stars below. He beckoned me over, and for the first time I stood at the edge of the glass not as a ghost, but as an architect. He sat at the mahogany desk and pulled a digital tablet toward him. With a single fluid motion, the same hand that had guided my aim in the dark, he signed the Atmospheric Freedom Act. The data rippled through the grid instantly. I felt it through the residual connection in my nerves, the valves in the drift quarter opening wide, the oxygen taxes being deleted from the worker hive accounts, the essentiality protocols being erased forever. For the first time in the history of the archipelago, breathing was no longer a debt. It was a right. The grid is stable, Solen, Kaelin murmured, leaning back as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the Isle of Glass into a prism of amber and gold. But it doesn't need a pilot anymore. It needs a conscience. I reached back, my fingers finding the neural jacks at the base of my skull. With a sharp, stinging tug, I pulled the copper wires free. The static that had defined my life for 24 years vanished, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. I wasn't wired into the island anymore. I wasn't a biological component or a piece of hardware. I was just Solène. Kaelin rose and walked back to me, his grey eyes finally reflecting the morning light instead of the abyss. He reached for the wires in my hand, but instead of taking them, he let them fall to the pristine marble floor. He took my hand, the hand that used to patch his pipes, the hand that had held his gun, and pressed his lips to my knuckles. It wasn't the kiss of a prince to a maid. It was the kiss of a survivor to the one who had taught him how to live. "The world is still loud," he whispered, his voice no longer a jagged rasp, but a soft resonance that filled the space between us. "But for the first time, I don't want to turn the volume down. I want to hear what you have to say next." We stood together at the edge of the world, looking out at an empire that was no longer built on silence. The racial barriers, the glass partitions, the oxygen debts, they were still there in the distance, waiting to be dismantled, but they weren't in this room. We weren't a monster and a machine anymore. We were two people who had learned that the only thing worth holding on to in a world of sinking islands was each other. The city hummed below us, a new frequency rising from the depths, and as the first true breath of freedom filled my lungs, I realized I was no longer afraid of the fall. I was finally part of the air.